didn't expect me to smile when he slid the envelope across the table. But I did. He was 53 years old, a man who had built 3 companies from nothing and sold 2 of them for more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He wore the kind of watch that didn't need to show off, and he had the kind of stillness that came from decades of being the most powerful person in every room he entered. He looked at me the way a landlord looks at a broken lease, as a problem with the solution he'd already calculated. The envelope had a number written on it in pen, not typed. Handwritten, like that made it more personal. $3 million. I picked it up. I turned it over once. I set it back down. Then I told him I needed to use the restroom, and I walked out of that restaurant and sat in my car for 11 minutes before I drove straight to my attorney's office. I should back up. I was 28 when I met his son. I was working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm in Charlotte. Not glamorous work, but I was good at it. I managed timelines, kept subcontractors accountable, handled the kind of details that make or break a build. My boss said I had the patience of a saint and the memory of a court reporter, and he meant it as a compliment. His son. I'll call him by what he was to me at the time, which is simply my boyfriend, came into my life through a mutual friend at a birthday dinner. He was funny in the way that charming people always are at first. Quick, self-deprecating, attentive. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered things. On our 3rd date, he mentioned his father's name. And I recognized it because everyone in Charlotte who works in commercial real estate knows that name. I didn't make a big deal of it. That was probably my first mistake, not asking more questions right then. We dated for 14 months. It was real, or at least it felt real to me. We talked about eventually moving in together. He met my mother and my older sister. I met exactly none of his family, which I rationalized as him being private, as men sometimes are when they've grown up in a household where everything is public. When I found out I was pregnant, I was 8 weeks along. I sat in my bathroom for a long time before I called him. He went quiet in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. He asked if I was sure. I told him I'd taken 4 tests. He said he needed some time to think. He took 6 days. When he finally called back, he didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask about my plans. He said his father wanted to meet with me. Not him, his father. I should have known what that meeting was going to be. The restaurant his father chose was the kind of place where a glass of water appears before you sat down, and no one talks above a murmur. I wore a blazer. I don't know why that detail matters to me now, but it does. I wanted to look like someone who couldn't be managed. His father was already seated. He stood when I walked in, shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from him. He had the same eyes as his son, that particular shade of gray-blue that looks measured even when it isn't. He started politely, asked about my work, my family, how I was feeling. He complimented the firm I worked for, said he'd done business with my boss years ago, said he was a good man. It was the opening of a negotiation dressed up as a conversation, and I recognized it because I'd sat in enough pre-construction meetings to know what it sounds like when someone is establishing rapport before they make an ask. Then he got to it. He said his son wasn't in a position, emotionally, professionally, to take on fatherhood right now. He said this not as an opinion, but as a fact, the way you'd state a zoning ordinance. He said that his family had a great deal of respect for me as a person, and that they wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He said that with the right support, I could have a very different life than the one I was living. Then he slid the envelope. $3 million. To walk away. To not involve lawyers, not involve courts, not involve his son's name in any legal document connected to this pregnancy. To, in his exact words, handle it quietly and move forward. I picked up the envelope. I turned it over. I set it back down. Then I went to my car, sat for 11 minutes, and drove to my attorney. Her name is Angie, and she's been practicing family law in Mecklenburg County for 19 years. She is not the kind of person who gets surprised easily. When I told her what had happened, she leaned back in her chair. looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then said, "Okay, tell me everything from the beginning." I did. All of it. The relationship, the pregnancy, the 6 days of silence, the restaurant, the envelope, the number written in pen. She asked me what I wanted, not what I was going to do, not what I should do, what I wanted. I told her I wasn't filing for revenge. I told her that much was true and stayed true through everything that came after. What I wanted was for my child to have legal acknowledgement of who their father was. I wanted child support calculated on actual income, not on whatever number his family decided was convenient. I wanted a record that existed in a courthouse and couldn't be revised later. Angie nodded and pulled out a yellow legal pad. She explained North Carolina's process for establishing paternity outside of marriage. She explained that I could request a court-ordered DNA test during pregnancy in certain circumstances, or we could file and establish paternity at birth. She explained that North Carolina uses an income shares model for child support, meaning both parents' incomes are considered, and that there was no cap on the amount the way some states have. The calculation follows the actual numbers. She said the word billionaire without blinking. She said, child support in high asset cases isn't symbolic. It reflects the standard of living the child would have had. I wrote that down on a napkin I had in my bag. I still have it somewhere. We filed a paternity action. Angie handled the paperwork, and 2 days later, a licensed process server delivered the documents to his son's home address. I know because Angie told me, and because his son called me 40 minutes after that, not to talk but to let me know in a voice I didn't recognize, that I had made a very serious mistake. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say. What came next was 8 months of legal process. I want to be honest about what that was like because the version people imagine and the version that actually happens are very different things. The version people imagine involves dramatic courtroom moments and sharp exchanges and everything resolving cleanly. The version that actually happens involves a lot of waiting. It involves document requests and responses and continuances and your attorney sending you emails at 7 p.m. that you read sitting on your couch in sweatpants, eating cereal for dinner because cooking feels like too much. It involves ultrasound appointments where you're alone in the waiting room and the tech asks if the father is coming and you say he couldn't make it, and she nods in the particular way that means she's heard that before. It involves your mother calling every Sunday and asking how you're holding up, and you saying fine because you don't want to worry her, and then hanging up and sitting very still for a few minutes before you go back to whatever you were doing. It involves being okay most of the time and then not okay at all for a few hours and then okay again. That's what it actually involves. His family hired a team. 2 attorneys, one of whom had been practicing family law in this state for longer than I've been alive. They filed motions. They questioned my timeline. They argued about jurisdiction in a way that Angie told me was standard delay tactic. They requested my financial records. They requested my medical records. They requested communications between me and their client going back to the beginning of our relationship. I gave them everything. I had nothing to hide and I knew that. My daughter was born in October. I had my sister with me, and my mother flew in from Raleigh 2 days before my due date because she said she wasn't going to leave anything to chance. The labor was long. The recovery was harder than I expected. The first night home with her, I sat in the rocking chair my mother had brought from her house, the same one she'd used with me and my sister, and I looked at my daughter's face and thought very clearly, whatever this costs, it was the right thing. DNA testing was completed when she was 6 weeks old. The results were what everyone already knew they would be. The legal process continued for another 4 months after that. There were 2 more hearings. There was a custody evaluation. His son, for his part, had by this point retained his own separate attorney from his family's team, which Angie said sometimes happens when adult children and their parents have different interests in a case. I didn't know what to make of that. At the final hearing, his family's attorney made a case for minimal support based on a complicated argument about what constituted reasonable need for a child of this age. Angie made a different argument. She had documentation. She had the income figures. She had the North Carolina Child Support Guidelines worksheet filled out with numbers that, when the judge looked at them, produced a very specific kind of silence in that room. His father was there. I hadn't expected that. He sat in the gallery in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and when the judge announced the support figure, I watched his face from across the room. He went pale. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies. Just a slight, controlled draining of color that a person who didn't know what to look for might have missed. I didn't miss it. The number the court said was significantly higher than the $3 million he'd offered me as a one-time payment. Not 3 times higher, not 10 times higher. But when you run the math over 18 years, at the rate the court set, accounting for the income-based calculation, the envelope he slid across that restaurant table would have been a bargain for them. He knew it. I could see that he knew it. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I don't say, because this is not a story about money. It was never a story about money. The child support matters because it means my daughter is legally recognized as having a father with specific court-documented responsibilities toward her. It means that in 18 years, if she wants to know her history, if she wants to understand who she comes from, there is a legal record that exists in a courthouse in Mecklenburg County that nobody can revise or erase. It means that the man who sat across a restaurant table from me and wrote a number on an envelope in pen, thinking that was the end of it, was wrong. That's what matters. His son has visitation rights that he exercises inconsistently. Some months I hear from his attorney with scheduling requests. Other months, nothing. My daughter is 14 months old now, and she doesn't know any of this yet. She knows her grandmother's face, and her aunt's voice, and the particular way I sound when I'm coming up the stairs at the end of the day, and she pulls herself up on the side of her crib and waits for me. That is her whole world right now, and I think it's a good one. I get asked sometimes by friends, by people who know pieces of the story, whether I regret not taking the money, whether $3 million wouldn't have made things easier, whether I ever lie awake and think about what I could have done with that. The honest answer is yes, sometimes. $3 million is not an abstract number. It would have changed the practical shape of my life in real and immediate ways. I won't pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would be dishonest, and this story doesn't have room for that. But then I think about what that money would have cost. It would have cost my daughter's right to know where she comes from. It would have cost a legal record. It would have cost whatever small, imperfect chance exists that her father might one day choose to show up, not because a court told him to, but because there is a court record that means he can't pretend she doesn't exist. It would have cost me something I don't entirely have a word for, something about not being managed. Something about walking out of that restaurant and sitting in my car and making a decision that was mine. Angie told me once, during one of the harder stretches of the process, that the work she does isn't really about outcomes in the way people think. She said that what courts do, at their best, is create a record of what happened, who was there, what was decided. She said that records matter in ways we can't always see at the time. I think about that a lot. My daughter is going to grow up knowing that when someone handed her mother an envelope and expected the problem to disappear, her mother drove to a lawyer's office instead. She's going to know that we showed up, that we put our name on a document and walked into a courthouse and let the process do what it's designed to do. That's not a small thing to know about yourself. And the man who wrote that number in pen, who sat across from me in a restaurant and calculated that I could be resolved, he's going to spend the next 17 years being reminded in the form of a monthly deposit that a judge calculated and a court ordered that he was wrong about that. I don't lie awake thinking about the money I didn't take. I sleep fine.